The air in the penthouse was as cold and sharp as the view of the city below. It wasn't the temperature from the climate control, but the chill of perfect, sterile wealth. Everything was polished concrete, sleek metal, and silent, hovering lights. In the center of the vast living room, two men sat surrounded by this expensive emptiness. Elias Thorne was a man who had built an empire from lines of code. His money was so vast, it had stopped being a number and had become a force of nature, like gravity. But his face, lean and etched with a permanent frown, showed no joy in it. His eyes, the color of old steel, held a deep, weary disappointment with the entire world. A grand piano, a black, gleaming beast, sat untouched by the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was less an instrument here, and more a sculpture. A tombstone for a part of him he believed was dead. Across from him, swirling a glass of whiskey that cost more than most people's monthly rent, was David Chun. David was a critic, famous for his wit and his cruelty. His words in newspapers and online could make or break careers. He enjoyed the power, the game of it all. Where Thorne's silence was heavy, David's was sharp, waiting to pounce. Another flawless performance tonight, David said, breaking the quiet. He wasn't talking about the view. They'd just streamed a concert by a young, chart-topping violinist. Technically perfect. Every note placed with surgical precision. And about as moving as a dentist's drill. A muscle twitched in Thorne's jaw. He didn't look at David. He looked through him, at some invisible point in the past. "That's all there is now," Thorne said, his voice a low, flat rumble. Noise. Polished, packaged, soulless noise. They learned to play the notes, but the music, the thing that reaches in here, he tapped his own chest, a dull thud, is extinct. We've educated it out of them, marketed it into oblivion. David chuckled, a dry, crackling sound. "Oh, come off it, Elias. The drama. Genius isn't extinct. It's just not here, in your glass box. It's out there." He gestured vaguely toward the window, to the sprawling, messy city glittering below. "It's in basements and garages and dirty subway stations. You've just been up here too long to smell it." Thorne finally turned his gaze to David. The disappointment in his eyes hardened into something colder. A challenge. "You believe that? Truly? Or is that just another clever line for your column?" "I believe talent is a weed," David shot back, leaning forward. "It grows in the cracks, where you least expect it. You just have to know how to look." "Sentimentality." Thorne dismissed him with a wave. "Romantic nonsense. What's out there is raw material, at best. Unfinished, undisciplined. The machinery of the world grinds that raw talent into paste for the masses. The system destroys the very thing it claims to promote." The argument, an old one between them, began to heat up. David defended the few raw artists he'd seen in dive bars, their passion undeniable, even if their skill was rough. Thorne countered that passion without supreme control was just noise. And that true, transformative artistry, the kind that once made him, a former prodigy, feel alive, was a ghost. "You're not looking for an artist," David sneered, his patience snapping. "You're looking for a unicorn to prove your miserable worldview is right. You want the world to be empty, so you don't feel so alone in your castle." Thorne went very still. The insult hung in the chilled air. He slowly stood up and walked to the window, his back to David. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white. "You're so confident it's out there," Thorne said, his voice now dangerously quiet. "Confident enough to put your money where your mouth is? Not just money. Something you value." David swirled his whiskey, intrigued. "What are you suggesting?" Thorne turned. The chill in the room seemed to emanate from him now. "A wager. I have the resources to scour the cracks, as you call them. I will find someone." A true unknown. No conservatory pedigree, no professional record, no online following. A person who, by all accounts, should not be able to play. A barista. A cleaner. A student drowning in debt. I will find them, and in 6 months I will present them to you. You will listen to them play, in this room. David raised an eyebrow. And if they're good, you win? Good is subjective. Not good, Thorne interrupted, his eyes gleaming. Moving. If the performance is technically masterful, but leaves you cold, I lose. The measure is you. Your honest, unfiltered reaction. If the performance is so genuinely powerful, so human, that it moves you to tears, a real, unforced tear, then I win. David barked a laugh. You want to make me cry? With music? Elias, I've heard the greats. I've reviewed them. I am professionally unmoved. Then you have nothing to fear, Thorne said, a razor-thin smile touching his lips. The stakes. Your media group. The one you built from scratch. The one you actually care about. David's smile vanished. His media empire was his life's work, his true love. That's quite a bet. And if you win, Thorne continued, as if discussing the weather, I will sign over a controlling interest in Thorne Industries to you. You can be the king of the very machine you claim to despise. The air was sucked from the room. The sum was unimaginable. It was a bet for vanity, for the ultimate proof of a philosophical point. It was madness. David looked into Thorne's steel-colored eyes and saw no madness, only a cold, absolute certainty of his own rightness. He saw a man so rich, so isolated, that the only feeling left to him was the desire to be proven correct about the emptiness of everything. David's own pride, his professional identity as the man who knew talent, flared. He thought of the thrill of winning, of owning a piece of Thorne's fortress. He thought it was impossible for this broken man to find something that could crack his hardened shell. You're on, David said, his voice suddenly quiet. He set his glass down with a definitive click. 6 months. A complete unknown. And we record my reaction. No room for lies. Agreed, Thorne said. He didn't offer a handshake. The deal was sealed in the space between them, a vacuum of pure tension. After David left, Thorne stood alone in his silent palace. He activated a sleep device on his desk. A holographic display flickered to life, showing his head of security, a serious woman with watchful eyes. Initiate Project Coda, Thorne said, his voice devoid of any excitement. It was a clinical order. Parameters, age 16 to 30. No formal training beyond basic childhood lessons. No current professional affiliation with music. No significant public performance history. Scour all public spaces, community centers, obscure online forums. Look for anomalous skill. Raw, undisciplined output. Focus on. Feeling over precision. Understood, sir, the woman replied. And the end goal? Thorne looked past the hologram, back to the silent, gleaming piano. To prove a point, he said, and ended the call. The hunt began. For weeks, reports filtered in. A gifted street guitarist in Barcelona. A teen in Seoul who could play complex jazz by ear. A young woman in New Orleans with a voice like honey and smoke. Thorne reviewed the files, the audio clips, the hidden camera footage. Each time, he listened with that same stone-faced expression. He heard skill. He heard passion, sometimes. He even heard joy, but he didn't hear the ghost. He didn't hear the thing he remembered, the thing that could make time stop and your heart feel both broken and mended in the same moment. He heard more noise. Interesting noise, but noise all the same. As the 3rd month approached, his certainty began to feel heavy, even to him. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps the world was empty. The thought brought no satisfaction, only a deeper, more profound cold. He had bet his kingdom on the absence of a thing, and he was starting to fear he would win. The city was having one of those nights. The rain wasn't falling. It was being thrown sideways by a wind that whipped between the buildings, making the streets into dark, glistening rivers. Elias Thorne sat in the back of his town car, the world outside a blur of neon and shadow. The latest report was open on his tablet. Another candidate, a young man in Prague who could play 2 trumpets at once. It was a trick, a circus act. He tossed the tablet onto the seat beside him, the glow lighting up his tired face. "Pull over," he said to the driver, his voice flat. "I'll walk the rest." The driver, a man used to strange requests from his employer, found a spot under the dripping awning of a closed flower shop. Thorne stepped out into the damp chill, the collar of his coat turned up. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to move, to feel the messy, uncurated reality of the world he claimed to understand so perfectly. This part of the city was older, the buildings shorter and grimmer. The polished glass towers of his life were just a distant glow. Here, the signs were handwritten, the windows lit by the blue flicker of televisions, not designer lamps. The sound was different too, the hiss of tires on wet pavement, a distant siren, the rumble of a late-night bus dot, and then another sound. Just a thread of it, almost lost in the wind dot. It was music. Piano music, but not from a speaker. It was alive, imperfect, breathing. It came from below, from a set of concrete steps leading down to a basement door. A hand-painted sign read Greenwood Community Center. The letters faded. Thorne stood at the top of the stairs, the rain dripping from the ledge onto his shoulders. He should have turned away. This was not a place for him. But the music pulled at him. It was a classical piece, something by Chopin, he thought. But it was wrong. Or rather, it was right in a way that was all wrong. The tempo shifted like a heartbeat, speeding up with passion, slowing with a deep, aching sadness. And woven through the familiar chords was another melody, a haunting, unfamiliar line that sounded ancient and personal. He descended the steps, his expensive shoes slick on the wet concrete. The door was propped open with a brick, letting out a rectangle of warm, yellow light and the smell of old coffee and floor wax. He peered inside. The room was a cluttered, cozy mess. Folding chairs were stacked against a wall, plastered with children's drawings. A beaten-up sofa sat in a corner, and in the center of it all, under a single bright fluorescent tube, was an upright piano. It was old, the wood scarred, the yellowed keys probably chipped, and at the piano sat a young woman. She was lost in the music. Her eyes closed, her head moving slightly with the rhythm of her own strange creation. Her hands, while not possessing the practiced grace of a concert pianist, moved with a fierce, natural certainty. She wasn't just playing the notes. She was wrestling with them, coaxing the old piano to weep and sing. She finished the piece with a soft, resolving chord that hung in the dusty air, and then she just sat there, her shoulders rising and falling with a quiet breath. Thorne realized he had been holding his own breath. The cold disappointment that had been his constant companion for months was gone, replaced by a startling, electric clarity. This was it. This was the raw, uncut thing he'd been hunting for. The noise was gone. All he could hear was the echo of the music, and the ghost he thought was dead was suddenly, unmistakably, alive in this shabby room. The young woman opened her eyes and saw him. She startled, sliding off the piano bench. "Oh, sorry, the center's closed. I'm finishing up cleaning." She gestured vaguely toward a rolling cart with cleaning supplies. Thorne stepped fully into the light. He knew he looked out of place, a sleek, gray figure in this world of warm clutter. That piece, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. What was the second melody? She looked wary, wiping her hands on her jeans. That's just something my grandmother taught me. A folk tune from her home. I sometimes mix them together. Sorry if it sounded strange. It didn't, Thorne said, and the simplicity of the statement felt foreign on his tongue. He needed to know more. You play here often? She gave a small shrug. I clean here 3 nights a week. They let me play when I'm done. It's quiet. My apartment has paper-thin walls. She started moving the cleaning cart, a signal that the conversation was over. I should get back to work. Wait. The word came out sharper than he meant. He softened his tone, reaching for the story he and his lawyer had crafted for this moment. My name is Elias. I run a private arts foundation. We give grants to undiscovered talent, to help them focus on their craft full-time. She stopped, suspicion deepening in her eyes. A foundation, right? And you just happen to wander into community basements on rainy nights. It's my job to wander, Thorne said, the lie feeling more comfortable now. To listen. What's your name? She hesitated. Leela. Leela, he repeated. How did you learn? My grandmother. She played by ear. She couldn't read a note of sheet music, but she could make that old piano in her living room sound like a whole orchestra. She taught me her songs before she passed. Leila's gaze drifted to the piano. I took some lessons at school for a year, but it wasn't the same. They wanted me to forget her way and do it the right way. Thorne's mind was racing, fitting the pieces into place. No formal training. A deeply personal, folk-based foundation. A clear, raw emotional connection to the music. She was perfect. She was the living answer to David Chun's challenge. We have a program, Thorne continued, his voice adopting a rehearsed, persuasive calm. A 6-month intensive. We provide a living stipend, an apartment, and access to some of the best instructors in the world. No strings, no debt. The goal is simply to develop your unique voice. At the end, you'd give 1 private performance for our donors. That's all. Leila laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. Why? Why me? There are 1,000,000 people better than me. Because they are polished, Thorne said, and for the first time, he was speaking a completely honest truth to her. You are not. You have something they have tried to educate out of themselves. My foundation exists to protect that something. He saw her waver. He saw the practical worries flash in her eyes, the rent on her tiny apartment, the stack of bills, the memory of her grandmother's dream for her that was always shoved aside for survival. It's safe, he said, pulling a simple, elegant business card from his coat. It had only a phone number and an email address on it. Think about it. Call this number tomorrow if you're interested. They'll answer any questions you have. He placed the card on top of the piano. He didn't wait for her answer. He simply nodded and turned, walking back up the steps into the pounding rain. Leila stared at the card. She picked it up. It felt heavy, substantial. She looked at the door, then at the silent, waiting piano. She played a few notes of her grandmother's lullaby. The sound small and lonely in the empty room got. The next day, after a sleepless night, she called the number. A polite, efficient woman answered, confirming everything. The offer was real. A car would pick her up in 2 days if she agreed. Leila stood in her apartment, looking at the photo of her grandmother on her small dresser. The old woman was smiling, her eyes crinkled with joy. Leila thought of the feeling she got when the music flowed just right, that connection that felt like her grandmother was right beside her. She thought of the endless cycle of work and worry. She packed a single suitcase. When the sleek, nondescript car arrived, she got in, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was taken not to an office, but to a quiet, beautiful apartment in a calm part of the city. It was fully furnished, simple but good. A brand new, high-quality digital piano sat in the living room. A folder on the table contained her schedule. Her first lesson was tomorrow. That night, alone in the strange, quiet space, she sat at the new piano. It felt different. The keys were perfectly weighted, the sound crystal clear through the headphones. She tried to play her grandmother's tune, but it came out sterile, like a perfect copy of a fading memory dot. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of doubt. What had she done? Who was this mysterious Elias? And what did he really want from her? Miles away, in his penthouse, Elias Thorne watched a live video feed on his monitor. It showed Layla sitting at the piano, her head in her hands. He watched, his face impassive. His assistant's voice came through the speaker. "Subject is settled, sir. The masters begin tomorrow. Do you have any specific instructions?" Thorne stared at the screen, at the young woman who held his fortune and his fragile proof in her untrained hands. "Proceed," he said, and switched off the monitor, leaving her alone in the silent, gilded cage he had built. The new apartment was too quiet. For Layla, silence had always been a temporary thing, filled by the city's constant hum or the chatter of the coffee shop where she worked. This silence was thick and heavy, like a blanket. The only thing that broke it was the relentless, precise sound of the piano. Her days fell into a strict rhythm. A car would collect her each morning and take her to a stunning, sunlit studio in a converted warehouse. Her teachers were like ghosts from another world. One was a stern Russian woman with hands that looked like bird bones, but could strike the keys with shocking power. She drilled Layla on scales and arpeggios for hours, her voice a sharp command. Again, the fourth finger is lazy. It is not a suggestion. It is a note. Another teacher, a gentle older man from France, focused on the classics. He had her play simple Mozart sonatas, dissecting every phrase. "The emotion is in the space between the notes, ma chère," he would say. "You rush through the silence as if you are afraid of it." Leela tried. She tried until her shoulders ached and her fingers felt stiff and foreign. She tried to forget the way her grandmother played, with a flowing, singing tone that ignored the strict rules of the metronome. The teachers were kind in their way, but they were builders. They saw her as a piece of raw marble, and their job was to chip away everything that was rough, everything that was her, to find the perfect statue inside. At night, she would return to the quiet apartment and try to play her grandmother's lullaby. But the new, proper technique got in the way. The folk melody sounded clumsy when played with perfect posture. The soul of it seemed to retreat, hiding from the bright, clinical light of her new education. She began to feel like a stranger to herself. The music that had been her comfort, her secret conversation with her past, was becoming a difficult task. A problem to be solved. Elias Thorne observed all of this from a distance. A small, discreet camera in the studio fed a video stream to a monitor in his office. He watched her struggle. He saw the frustration on her face during the technical drills. He saw the brief, fleeting joy when she first played a difficult passage correctly, quickly followed by a look of emptiness. He watched it all with the cool focus of a scientist monitoring an experiment. He took notes, not on her musical progress, but on her spirit. He saw it dimming, and a part of him felt a cold satisfaction. It proved his point. The raw thing was fragile. The system, even his benevolent one, crushed it. One afternoon, the pressure broke. The Russian teacher was having her repeat a fiendishly difficult exercise by Czerny, a torrent of notes meant for building speed. Feel the rhythm in your blood. The teacher insisted, tapping the stand violently with a pencil. It is not a folk dance. It is mathematics. Layla's hands stumbled, a clashing chord ringing out wrong. She slammed her hands down on the keys in a sudden, shocking burst of noise. "Enough!" she cried, the word bursting out of her. "This isn't music. This is factory work. You're taking the heart out of it." The teacher drew back, her face a mask of offended professionalism. "The heart is built on discipline. You cannot run before you can walk." "I wasn't running before," Leila said, her voice trembling. "I was flying my own way. Now I can't even remember how to walk without you counting for me." She got up from the piano bench, her face hot with tears of anger. "I need some air." She didn't wait for permission. She walked out of the studio, down the hall, and found a small balcony overlooking the city. She gripped the railing, taking deep, shaky breaths. Below, life moved on cars, people, noise, realness. She felt trapped in a beautiful, silent bell jar. Inside, the teacher spoke softly into her phone. A moment of rebellion, not unexpected with the untrained. "She will cool down." Thorne heard this report through his earpiece. He watched on the monitor as the empty studio waited. He felt nothing, or so he told himself. Later that evening, Leila was in the apartment kitchen, making tea. The door to the small utility closet was slightly ajar. Inside, she saw a sleek gray panel she hadn't noticed before. It had a small green power light. A router? A modem? Curious, she gently pulled the panel open. Behind it wasn't internet equipment. It was a small, high-tech setup with a lens. A camera. It was pointed directly at the main living space. At the piano, a freezing cold wave washed over her, followed by a scalding hot one of rage. She wasn't being given a grant. She was being watched, studied. Her mind raced, piecing together the strange pieces. The mysterious Elias, the no-strings-attached generosity, the single, upcoming performance, the intense, almost desperate focus on her raw talent. It felt wrong. It felt like she was a specimen in a jar. She didn't sleep. The next morning, when the car arrived, she got in silently. But instead of going to the studio, she told the driver she felt sick and needed to go back. Once in the apartment, she waited. She knew he was watching. She looked directly at the spot where she'd found the camera, her eyes hard. Then she went to the piano. She didn't play scales. She didn't play Mozart. She played her grandmother's lullaby, pouring all her confusion, her homesickness, her betrayal into the familiar, mournful tune. She played it for the hidden eye. She played it as a challenge. When she finished, she spoke to the empty room, her voice clear and steady. "I know you're there. I want to talk to him. To Elias, today." An hour later, a car arrived. This time, it took her to the penthouse. The elevator opened directly into the vast, cold living room. Thorne was standing by the window, his back to her. He turned, and his face showed no surprise, no guilt. It was just its usual cold, composed mask. "Your progress is acceptable," he began, his tone that of a manager reviewing a report. "Why is there a camera in my apartment?" Leila asked, cutting him off. She didn't move from the elevator door. "To ensure your safety. To monitor your practice habits for the teacher's review." "Don't lie to me," she said, her voice low but fierce. "This isn't a grant. What is this really? What am I to you?" Thorne was silent for a long moment. He looked at her, this young woman vibrating with anger and intelligence. He saw the raw thing again, not in the music this time, but in her defiant stance. He decided coldly that the truth was the most efficient tool. "It's a wager," he said simply. He told her everything. The bet with the critic. The terms. His belief that true artistry was dead. Her role as his chosen experiment to prove it. "You are the potential proof," he concluded, "that I am right. The air left Leela's lungs. She felt used, hollow. She was just a thing, a pawn in a rich man's game. Her grandmother's music, her most precious possession, was just a chip in a billion-dollar gamble. She should have walked out. She should have cursed him and left. But a deeper fire was stirring. She looked at his cold, certain face, at the untouched grand piano, at this entire frozen world of his. "So that's it," she said, her voice now eerily calm. "You think my grandmother's song, my hands, you think they're just tools to win an argument. You think the heart of it can be measured in a tear from some critic." "I know it can," Thorne said. Leila took a step forward, her eyes locked on his. "You're wrong about everything. But most of all, you're wrong that I'm just proof for your point." She turned and walked toward the grand piano. She didn't sit with the perfect posture she'd been taught. She sat on the bench like she did in the community center, a little slumped, ready for a fight. "Everyone has been trying to fix me," she said, her hands hovering over the magnificent keys. "To make me proper. To make me fit. You want me raw? You want me real?" She looked back at him, a challenge blazing in her eyes. "Then let me be real. Stop trying to rebuild me. Let me play. Not to prove you right. To prove you wrong." She brought her hands down. She didn't play the lullaby. She played a storm. It was the classical exercises, the scales, the twisted, distorted, run through with the raw, crying melody of her grandmother's folk tune. It was anger and sorrow and defiance. It was technically a mess in parts, but it was alive, violently, beautifully alive. Thorne stood rigid. The cold satisfaction was gone. In its place was a shock, a vibration he hadn't felt in decades. She wasn't breaking. She was transforming right in front of him, and she was doing it by refusing to be his subject. When the last echoing note faded, the silence in the penthouse was different. It was charged. Leela stood up. "The lessons continue," she said, not asking, telling. "But on my terms. I'll learn their techniques, but I'll use them for my music, my grandmother's music. You can watch all you want, but you're not watching an experiment anymore." She walked back to the elevator, leaving him alone with the ghost of her music still hanging in the air. Thorne did not move for a long time. He looked at his own hands, then at the piano where hers had just been. For the first time, the outcome of the bet felt uncertain. She wasn't just a subject. She had become a force, and he had no idea how to control the force. The air in the penthouse was different on the night of the performance. It was still cold, still perfect, but now it was charged with a tense, silent electricity. The vast space had been transformed. The furniture was pushed back. In the center of the room, sitting like a lone island under a focused, soft light, was the grand piano. Around it, in a loose half-circle, were 12 chairs. Only 12. They were not concert seats. They were the same elegant, uncomfortable chairs that always lived there. This was not to be a public spectacle. It was a private unveiling, a surgical strike. In each chair sat a person of impossible wealth, influence, or taste. They murmured quietly, curious about this mysterious event Thorne had summoned them to. They knew only that they were to witness a discovery. David Chun sat in the front, right of center. He looked relaxed, legs crossed, a faint, amused smile on his lips. His sharp eyes took in the room, the guests, the sterile setup. To his right, a small, discreet tripod held a camera. Its red recording light, a single unblinking eye, pointed directly at his face. The measure of the bet. Calais Thorne stood in the shadows by the window, a glass of water in his hand. He wore a suit so dark it seemed to swallow the light. His face was a calm mask, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the glass. He was not watching the guests. He was watching the closed door to the private elevator downstairs. In a small, serene preparation room, Lila was trying to breathe. She wore a simple, dark green dress, nothing flashy. Her hands were cold. The past 3 months had been a whirlwind. After her confrontation with Thorn, something had shifted. The teachers, once her taskmasters, had become her collaborators. The stern Russian woman, upon hearing Lila passionately explain the folk scales of her grandmother's music, had dug up old, neglected compositions that used similar modes. The Frenchman helped her structure her emotions, to give the storm inside her a shape. Without trying to change the nature of the storm, she was not the same player who had entered the community center. She was a fusion. Her technique was now polished, powerful, controlled. But the soul of it, the aching, sinning heart, was still her own. She had built a bridge between two worlds. The final piece she would play tonight was hers. An original composition she called Roots and Sky. It was her grandmother's lullaby, but it had grown. It was a story of leaving home, of loss, of finding your voice in a new world, and of the deep, enduring pull of where you come from. A quiet attendant nodded to her. It was time. The elevator ride was silent. When the doors opened into the penthouse, all conversation stopped. Every head turned. Layla felt their eyes curious, assessing, bored. She saw David Chun's evaluating glance, the slight tilt of his head. She saw Thorn, a statue in the gloom. She walked to the piano. She did not look at the guests. She sat, adjusted the bench slightly, and let her hands rest in her lap. She took one last, deep breath, and thought not of the bet, not of the billionaires, but of her grandmother's hands, weathered and strong, dancing over those yellowed keys in a sunlit living room, full of dust and love. She began. Her first piece was Chopin's Ballade No. 1. It was a deliberate choice, a standard of the repertoire, a test of technical and emotional mastery. Her fingers were sure, her phrasing intelligent. She played it with a clarity and passion that made a few guests lean forward. It was, by any measure, a beautiful performance. Thorn watched David Chun. The critic gave a small, appreciative nod. He tapped a finger lightly on his knee in time with the music. He was engaged. He was impressed. But his eyes were dry. His smile was that of a professional enjoying a job well done. When the final notes faded into warm applause, Chun joined in, a polite, measured clapping. The look he shot Thorn was clear. Asterisk, very good. But not enough. You lose. Asterisk. Thorn's stomach tightened. The cold certainty began to creep back in. He had given her the tools, and she had built exactly what he feared. Another excellent, moving, but ultimately unmiraculous performer. The ghost remained elusive. Layla acknowledged the applause with a small bow. Then she turned back to the keys. Her posture changed. It became less formal, more inward. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear but soft in the quiet room. "The piece you just heard, it is a language I learned here. A beautiful language. But my first language, the one my heart still speaks, came from my grandmother. She came here with nothing but a suitcase and her music. She taught me that a melody is a place you can go back to, a home you carry inside you." She paused, her fingers hovering. "This is for her." Then she began Roots and Sky. It started with a simple, haunting folk tune, played with a naked vulnerability that made the Chopin seem suddenly like a grand speech. This was a whisper in the dark. Then her left hand introduced a low, rumbling rhythm, like distant thunder or a heartbeat. The classical training showed itself not in flashy runs, but in the incredible control she wielded. She built layers. The folk melody began to dance with complex harmonies, to twist and turn through different keys, like a memory being viewed from every angle, sometimes sweet, sometimes painful. The music swelled. It wasn't just sad. It was joyful, angry, longing, and proud all at once. She used the full, thunderous power of the grand piano to evoke the storm of crossing an ocean, then dropped back to a single, pure line for the loneliness of a new city. You could hear the child listening at the door, the grandmother's fading strength, the young woman trying to hold on to a ghost through the language of keys. Thorne forgot to watch. Chun. He was gripped by the music itself. He saw not just notes, but the story. He saw the community center, the rain, the love, and the struggle. The cold mask on his face cracked. He felt something stir, a long dormant ache. He wasn't thinking of the bet. He was remembering why he had once loved music, before it became a thing to own or a point to prove. David Chun's polite, engaged expression had melted away. His professional detachment, the armor he wore to every performance, began to fissure. He was not analyzing the structure or the technique anymore. He was simply feeling it. The music bypassed his critic's brain and went straight to the core of him, to his own immigrant parents, who worked until their hands were raw, to the secret dreams he'd traded for influence, to the lonely price of being the man who passes judgment. His carefully maintained smirk was gone. His lips were parted slightly. His eyes, fixed on Layla's flowing hands, began to glisten. Layla moved into the final movement. A reconciliation. The folk melody returned, but now it was woven into a soaring, hopeful chord progression. It was no longer a memory of a lost home, but the foundation of a new one. It was strength born from roots. She played the final resolving chords with a solid, peaceful grace, and then there was silence, a total, profound silence. The kind that isn't empty, but full. Layla let her hands fall into her lap, her head bowed. For a full 5 seconds, no one moved. Then a guest sniffed, dabbing quickly at her eye. Another let out a shaky breath. The applause began, not polite this time, but deep, emotional. A release of tension. But all Thorne could see was David Chun. Chun was not clapping. He sat perfectly still in his chair. His face was turned toward the piano, but he wasn't seeing the room. He was somewhere else entirely. And then, as the applause washed around him, a single clear tear escaped the corner of his eye. It traced a path down his cheek, catching the light. He seemed unaware of it. He made no move to wipe it away. The camera's red light glowed steadily. It had seen it. It had captured the undeniable physical proof. The bet was over. Thorne had won. The guests rose, beginning to mill, wanting to approach Layla to give their compliments. But Thorne stood frozen, his victory ash in his mouth. He had wanted to prove that the ghost of true artistry didn't exist. Instead, Layla had conjured it right in front of him. So powerfully it had broken a man who was professionally unbreakable. He had gotten exactly what he wanted. And for the first time, he understood the terrifying weight of it. He had won his fortune. But he had lost the argument that defined his world. And in the face of the real human beauty he had just witnessed, that argument now felt small, ugly, and utterly, devastatingly worthless. The applause finally died down, leaving a buzzing quiet in its wake. The guests, moved and chattering, began to drift towards Layla, their faces full of questions and praise. She handled them with a quiet grace, a faint, tired smile on her face, but her eyes kept searching the room. They found Elias Thorne, still a statue in the shadows by the window. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't even looking at David Chun, who sat slumped in his chair, slowly wiping his face with a handkerchief, looking older and emptied out. Thorne was staring at the piano, as if the ghost of the music still sat on the bench. Layla extricated herself from the well-wishers and walked towards him. The crowd, sensing a private moment, parted for her. She stopped a few feet away. "You won," she said, Her voice was flat. Not angry, not happy. Just stating a fact. Thorne blinked, as if coming back from a great distance. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since she'd started playing. He saw the exhaustion under her eyes, the residual tremble in her hands that she was trying to hide by clasping them together. "I did," he replied. The words had no triumph in them. "What happens now?" She asked. "Do I go back to my life? Now that your point is proven?" Her question hung between them. It was the question he had never truly considered. The experiment was over. The data was recorded. The subject was to be dismissed. "Your apartment is yours, if you want it," he said, the businessman in him automatically offering the payment. "The grant can continue. You can study wherever you wish." Layla just shook her head slowly, a sad little movement. "You still don't get it. I don't want your grant. I never did. I thought someone had finally heard the music. Not the technique. The music." She turned to leave, then paused. "My things will be out of the apartment by tomorrow." She walked away, towards the elevator, leaving him standing alone in his victory. The next day, Thorne's world was perfectly intact, yet it felt completely hollow. Legal documents arrived from David Chun's lawyers, transferring control of his media group. It was the largest financial win of Thorne's life, and he felt nothing. He sat in his silent penthouse, the emptiness now a physical pressure. He tried to listen to music, great, celebrated recordings, but they sounded like noise again. Only now, the silence was worse, because he could remember what real sound felt like. He had to see her. He didn't know why. There was no more bet to monitor, no more point to prove. It was a need, a pull he didn't understand. He told his driver to take him to the old neighborhood. The rain was gone, replaced by a dull gray afternoon. He descended the steps to the Greenwood Community Center. The door was again propped open. Inside, she was there. Not cleaning. Just sitting at the old scarred piano in her jeans and a simple sweater. She wasn't playing. She was just sitting, one hand resting lightly on the keys. A small suitcase stood by the door. He cleared his throat. She didn't turn around. "Come to check on your investment?" Her voice was tired. "No," he said, and it was the truth. He walked into the room, the space feeling smaller and more real than he remembered. "I don't know why I came." Now she turned. Her face was clean of makeup, her expression unguarded. She looked young and sad and strong. "You were right about one thing, you know," she said. "The world is full of noise. But you were wrong about why. It's not because the talent is gone. It's because people like you put a price on the soul of things. You turn songs into transactions. You turned my grandmother's lullaby into a weapon to win an argument." Each word was a quiet blow, landing with more force than any business rival's insult ever had. Because they weren't angry. They were true. "I heard the music," he said, the admission surprising him as it left his lips. "Last night, I felt it. Did you?" she asked, turning back to the piano. "Or did you just feel like you won?" He had no answer. The silence stretched. He watched her shoulders rise and fall with a slow breath. Then she did something unexpected. She played a simple 5-note phrase, the very core of the folk tune. It hung in the dusty, sunlit air of the community room, pure and unadorned. Thorne stared at her hands on the yellowed keys. A memory, sharp and painful, flashed. Himself at 8 years old, before the competitions, before the pressure, before the money. Sitting at his first piano, hitting a key just to hear the sound, a grin of pure discovery on his face. Without thinking, without planning, he moved. He walked to the piano bench. She looked up, startled, but didn't move away. He sat down beside her. The bench was small. Their shoulders almost touched. He looked at the keyboard, then at his own hands that wrote billion-dollar code, that shook on world-changing deals. They looked alien to him now. Tentatively, stiffly, he reached out his right hand. He hovered over the keys, a man afraid to touch a holy thing. Then he pressed a single note. A C it rang out, slightly out of tune. Real. Lila watched him, her anger softening into something like curiosity. She played the 5-note phrase again. Hesitantly, Thorne tried to match it, his fingers clumsy. He played a wrong note, a dissonant clash. He flinched, expecting criticism, a sharp remark. Layla didn't speak. She just played the phrase again, slowly. He tried again. This time, he got it. A simple, correct echo of her melody. A corner of her mouth lifted, just a little. She added a left-hand note, a gentle harmony. He listened, then found a matching bass note, his movement a little more sure. They weren't performing. There was no audience, no bet, no fortune at stake. It was a conversation. A clumsy, quiet, wordless conversation between two people who had only ever used music as a shield or a weapon. He played a phrase from a classical piece he'd learned as a child. She answered with a variation of her folk tune, weaving it around his notes. It was messy. It was imperfect. It was full of pauses and wrong turns. But in that shared, imperfect sound, something broke open in Elias Thorne. The cold, hard shell around him cracked. He wasn't a billionaire. He wasn't a genius or a disillusioned recluse. He was just a man, sitting at a battered old piano, trying to remember a language he'd forgotten. And for the first time in decades, he felt something other than cold certainty or weary disappointment. He felt a flicker of the old, simple joy. The joy of the sound itself. When they finally stopped, the last note fading into the quiet room, he was breathing heavily, as if he'd run a mile. He looked at her, and his eyes, for the first time she had ever seen, were clear and wet. "I was wrong," he whispered. The 3 most expensive words he had ever spoken. She nodded slowly. "I know." He stood up, the spell broken, but the feeling lingering. He pulled a card from his pocket, a different one this time, with his personal, private number. He placed it on top of the piano, next to the music book. "The offer isn't a grant," he said, his voice rough. "It's an apology. Use it however you want. For yourself. For this place." He gestured around the community center. No strings. No cameras. He left without waiting for an answer. Layla picked up the card. She looked at the suitcase by the door, then at the piano. She sat back down and began to play just for herself. The story didn't end with a grand partnership or a romantic flourish. It ended with 2 people, separately, starting to heal. Layla used the fund, a staggering sum transferred with no contract, with fierce intelligence. She didn't buy a grand piano for herself. She bought 10 good, sturdy ones for community centers across the city. She started a free program, not to create prodigies, but to give people, especially kids and elders, the space to find their own sound. She called it the Roots Project. Elias Thorne, quietly and without fanfare, dissolved the legal transfer from David Chun. He didn't take the media empire. Instead, he and Chun, in a series of terse, awkward meetings, used its resources to create a foundation. Its sole purpose was to seek out and fund artists working in the cracks, not to mold them, but to protect their space to grow. He sold a portion of his own company to endow it permanently. He never played the grand piano in his penthouse again. But sometimes, on gray afternoons, his driver would find himself parked near the Greenwood Community Center. Thorne would sit in the back seat, the window down, listening to the messy, beautiful, real sounds of people learning, failing, and discovering music. And sometimes, if he listened closely, he could hear a familiar folk tune, strong and sure, weaving through the noise, teaching a new generation how to fly. He had bet his fortune that a girl couldn't play. And in losing that bet, he had finally learned how to listen.